May 1960 opened with a sky that looked familiar and a tension that did not. High above cloud lines, a single mission unraveled, and the Cold War's quiet contest stepped into the light. The result was not thunder, but exposure, a flight that ended in wreckage on foreign soil and a living witness in the hands of a rival. What followed moved quickly from airfields to offices, from coded cables to crowded press rooms. In Washington, measured words tried to hold the line. In Moscow, displays of evidence aimed to seize the narrative. Families around kitchen tables read headlines that seemed to shift by the hour. A summit planned for Paris hung in the balance. This program recounts the episode as a historical reconstruction. It draws on known events and public records from 1960, and it also considers reasonable interpretations that observers at the time might have entertained. Dates, locations, and atmospheres reflect the era's texture, and any speculation remains clearly framed as possibility rather than fact. The intent is to present a careful, sober account that follows the trail from the thin air of an unusual flight to the heavy air of diplomacy under strain. No final judgment is offered here. Instead, the story traces how secrecy meets scrutiny, how official versions evolve, and how credibility, once shaken, can shape the course of talks where words are weapons and silence is seldom neutral. The story begins before dawn, when crews worked in practiced quiet and a high-altitude reconnaissance plan moved from briefing notes to takeoff. The Cold War had settled into a tense routine by 1960, and flights that stayed in shadows had become part of that routine. This one did not. At altitude far above common air lanes, the mission depended on distance, calm weather, and the expectation that time aloft would be measured by fuel and not by fate. The end came suddenly. Somewhere over Soviet territory, the aircraft did not make it home. The pilot survived and was taken into custody. On the ground, there was debris, there were questions, and there was a prisoner whose existence would soon complicate every sentence crafted in Washington. In the first hours, little was certain outside closed rooms. The world learned in fragments as Moscow described a foreign incursion and hinted at proof. Western audiences heard a different start to the story, statements that suggested a civilian research craft, a loss of control, a route gone off course. That version seemed designed to buy time. It did not hold. Within days, the other side presented material remains and, more damaging, a living pilot. The announcement seized the initiative and shifted the burden. In homes and offices, two indicators stood out to the public: the speed with which the Soviet side moved to show tangible evidence, and the cautious, evolving language used in Washington as officials adjusted their explanation. Both signaled that the facts in circulation were not fully aligned with the first narrative. In an age when official communique could command deference, this was a test of patience and trust. Reporters asked for clarity and received carefully hedged replies. Allies asked for reassurance and got briefings that bordered on lectures in restraint. Inside the United States, the episode collided with a self-image built on confidence and a promise of measured leadership. The idea that skies could be traversed without consequence now looked less like policy and more like a gamble that had not paid off. In Soviet cities, meanwhile, attention centered on the spectacle of proof. Photographs, testimonies, and controlled access allowed foreign correspondents to witness enough to fill articles, but not enough to challenge the official frame. The pilot's existence turned conjecture into leverage. It meant the story could be told not only with wreckage, but with a person who could be placed before cameras and courts. For the Kremlin, that created a rare moment of advantage in a long contest that often favored Western presentation. For Washington, it created a dilemma: admit the true nature of the mission and face the diplomatic cost, or continue to seek ambiguity and risk a deeper cut when more details appeared. The wider effect came quickly. Conversations in capitals shifted from technical questions to strategic ones. How many such flights had taken place, and how many had been tolerated without public notices from those beneath their paths? The answers remained mostly unspoken, but the silence did not signal acceptance. It sounded like calculation. Within bureaucracies on both sides, the event became a case study in exposure and denial. Plans were reviewed, procedures were defended, responsibility was distributed across committees and memoranda. Ordinary citizens hearing official voices avoid certain words drew their own conclusions. This was not a firefight, a blockade, or a crisis with troops at borders. Yet the stakes felt comparable because they reached into the core of statecraft, the right to know and the right to hide. By the end of the first week, the mission had ceased to be a discrete failure and had become raw material for larger arguments about power, trust, and the fragile balance that kept the Cold War from burning hotter. The immediate future pointed toward a courtroom in Moscow and a meeting room in Paris, with each venue promising not closure, but escalation through exposure. The failed flight, once intended to gather information without a trace, had become the most visible object in the Cold War sky. In Washington, the decision tree narrowed with every statement made in Moscow. Early talking points, shaped to suggest mishap and civilian purpose, soon met the weight of contrary facts. The existence of the captured pilot, revealed after carefully timed announcements, forced a reckoning. Advisors understood that credibility once spent would not be easily regained. Acknowledgement seemed inevitable, yet every admitted detail risked widening the gap between what had been said and what was now known. The head of state carried two burdens at once: protect intelligence practices that had become central to deterrence, and preserve the posture of a leader seeking reduced tensions in Europe. Officials wrote drafts with cautious verbs and passive constructions. Each line tried to seal cracks without drawing attention to the wall. Across the ocean, the Soviet leader measured his steps with the confidence of someone holding the better hand. He denounced the violation in terms that were accessible to audiences far beyond party halls. He also held back the most potent element at first. When he finally confirmed that the pilot lived, he did more than embarrass an opponent. He undercut the structure of plausible explanation that Washington had built in the first days. Around Allied tables, the reaction was mixed. Some accepted the necessity of retrieving information in hostile skies. Others worried that the price would be paid in diplomatic coin at the worst possible time. The Paris summit was approaching. Expectations for progress were already modest. Now they risked being replaced by damage control. Two indicators shaped how observers read the moment. First, the timing of disclosures from Moscow appeared deliberate, with each release designed to corner the other side without triggering outright panic. Second, the shift in American language, from accident to acknowledgement in a matter of days, suggested both internal debate and the limits of managing a story once the other side held the person at its center. These were not merely public relations pressures. They bore directly on the negotiating position of a president who had styled himself as steady, pragmatic, and cautious around grand gestures. Inside meeting rooms, aides discussed options that all sounded unsatisfying. An apology could be interpreted as weakness, and it might invite demands for a halt to practices considered essential. A defiant stance might satisfy domestic hawks, but would likely deepen rifts with European partners who were already wary of sudden moves. A middle course, accepting responsibility without contrition, risked satisfying no one. The problem was compounded by the visibility of the captured pilot. He could not be erased from the record, and he could not be dismissed as an error without author. His presence guaranteed a trial, and the trial guaranteed fresh cycles of attention. The Soviet side understood this and prepared a process that would look orderly, even restrained, to foreign eyes. There was no need for brutality on display when the fact of capture functioned as a sustained indictment. For Washington, the courtroom across the line represented a problem that could not be solved at home. It required a diplomatic answer at a table where goodwill was already scarce. The dilemma sharpened when the summit drew near. The president faced the prospect of walking into Paris under a cloud raised by his own apparatus, while his counterpart arrived ready to speak as the wronged party. Advisors searched for language that could acknowledge facts, defend policy, and support the prospect of talks all at once. The craft of state speech met the limits of circumstance. Reporters sensed the strain. Questions grew more pointed and briefings grew more circular. The administration, so careful in tone throughout its term, now struggled to match words with realities that could not be softened by phrasing. In private, some argued for bold honesty on the grounds that voters respected forthrightness. Others warned that candor without a path forward would amount to a self-inflicted wound. The final approach reflected the era's preference for steadiness, admit the reconnaissance purpose in cautious terms, express regret for the violation, and insist that such efforts were a response to closed societies rather than an appetite for provocation. It was a calibrated answer aimed at preserving the larger strategy. Whether it would satisfy the other side was another matter, and very soon it would be tested in Paris. Paris in May 1960 should have offered a brief pause from the grind of confrontation. The city's atmosphere promised ceremony and an opportunity, however limited, to reduce misunderstandings. Instead, it became a stage where embarrassment and accusation crowded out every other theme. Delegations arrived with talking points prepared weeks in advance, yet all of them now seemed stale beside the immediate quarrel over the flight. The Soviet leader entered the venue with momentum. He had proof of intrusion, a living pilot, and a timeline that cast the West as reactive rather than principled. He demanded assurances. He insisted on accountability. He framed the affair as a test of sincerity for any future agreement. Across the table, the American president faced a bind that everyone in the hall could sense. To move past the incident, he would have to give something that looked like concession, and even that might not suffice. He proposed guarded language. He stressed the defensive posture of his nation and the need to avoid surprises. He tried to separate the incident from the broader agenda, arguing that long-term stability in Europe required a focus beyond a single breach. The attempt faltered. The meeting's tone shifted from negotiation to theater, with the Soviet side addressing not just its counterpart, but a global audience. Allies watched with unease. Some feared that an apology, even in polite form, would hand a rival a lasting victory. Others feared that refusal would collapse the summit and waste a rare platform for dialogue. The press, kept at a distance but not out of earshot, sensed that the event was becoming less a conversation and more a demonstration of will. Two indicators captured the moment's direction. First, the Soviet delegation's early insistence on formal condemnation left little room for the careful ambiguity that often sustains diplomacy. Second, the visible discomfort among several Western partners suggested that the coalition's internal alignment was under stress at precisely the moment unity was needed. The city's rhythm continued outside the conference building, but inside, the air felt stale and heavy. Cables went back to capitals with plain summaries. Positions hardened, prospects dim. The American side weighed whether to walk away before being pushed. The Soviet side weighed whether to push until the other left on its own. The result was a meeting that achieved very little beyond exposing how thin the fabric of trust had become. Each side claimed the posture of reason. Each claimed that the other had chosen pride over progress. For observers at a distance, the collapse of the summit seemed to confirm a pattern. Efforts to cool the Cold War were prone to reversal whenever secrecy met daylight. The incident had not caused all the friction, but it had supplied the spark and the tinder. It had provided the wronged party with a narrative that resonated with non-aligned states and citizens who measured fairness by borders. And it had left the initiator of the flight with explanations that sounded legalistic rather than moral. The embarrassment was not merely personal to leaders, it was institutional. It showed how fragile grand plans were when a small set of facts refused to bend. In the weeks that followed, officials spoke of resuming contact at some later date. They announced that channels remained open. They emphasized continuity of deterrence and the absence of immediate military escalation. Yet the damage sat beneath every line. American credibility had taken a bruise that adversaries would remember. Soviet confidence had swelled in a way that could invite overreach. European partners, caught in the middle, recalibrated their private estimates of how much risk Washington would accept to secure advantage. For ordinary people reading newspapers in cafes, the lesson seemed plainer. Leaders could schedule talks and pose for photographs, but one mishandled secret could empty a room faster than any argument about ideology. Paris had been set to offer small steps. Instead, it gave the world a tutorial in how exposure travels, from a cold sky to a courtroom, from a podium to a negotiating table, until the table itself is no longer a place for negotiation. The courtroom in Moscow was bright, orderly, and choreographed with quiet confidence. Officials arranged seats with precision and allowed foreign correspondents measured access. The pilot appeared calm, guarded by routine rather than menace, which seemed intentional. Prosecutors described an incursion that violated borders and trust, and they did so in plain terms. A translator repeated each line with careful pacing, turning accusation into a slow drumbeat. The defense spoke in limited ways, acknowledging circumstances but avoiding sweeping claims. It was a proceeding built to demonstrate control not only of the room, but also of the story. Paper exhibits were placed where cameras could see them. Maps appeared and disappeared with practiced rhythm. The message was clear enough for audiences near and far. This was not the frenzy of a sudden scandal. This was a state revealing its complaint in a format that suggested patience and inevitability. Observers from abroad noted two features that shaped impressions. First, the pace felt deliberate, as if each day's session was calibrated to sustain attention without risking fatigue. Second, access was controlled yet sufficient, allowing reporters to witness enough to write with confidence while still keeping crucial materials beyond reach. Those boundaries kept speculation alive while protecting the preferred narrative. In the West, newspapers printed photographs that did not need captions to unsettle readers. A familiar uniform, a restrained posture, an expression that said little yet carried weight. Families saw someone who could belong to their own towns and offices. That recognition narrowed the distance between statecraft and daily life. The pilot's presence became a human bridge for a geopolitical argument. The prosecution made use of that bridge without cruelty. There was no need to raise voices. The simple fact of custody said more than sharp language could. Even so, the trial did more than relay facts. It shaped context. It placed the episode in a frame where borders were sacred and surveillance was predation, where admission of purpose could stand as confession. Western officials pushed back with words about necessity and deterrence. They spoke of closed societies and the risks posed by secrecy. Yet those arguments traveled poorly inside a courtroom built to emphasize order. The presiding figure called recesses with ritual calm. The audience stood and sat according to signals learned over years. Cameras clicked in short bursts that marked transitions. Every element reminded outsiders that the proceedings were not a negotiation. They were a statement of jurisdiction and a performance of competency. The pilot spoke in brief passages. He acknowledged training. He recognized roots. He avoided larger questions of policy. His words, however limited, served as anchor points for headlines. Each sentence could be isolated and replayed across radio and television. In that repetition, the public found shape in a story that might otherwise feel remote. The impact reached beyond the bench. In Washington, planners recognized that each day in court drained political capital. Allies asked whether the timing of the trial was meant to weaken Western voices ahead of any new meeting. The answer seemed to be yes, or at least not no. The calendar favored the side that held the person, the artifacts, and the venue. Still, the trial did not close the question of motive. It raised new ones. If surveillance was commonplace, why choose this case to elevate? If high altitude promised safety, why had it failed now? If leaders sought a thaw, why risk a flare? The courtroom did not offer answers. It offered claims, rituals, and images that traveled efficiently. The effect was cumulative rather than explosive. Each day added a layer that made retreat harder for the accused state and made a formal concession more costly to request. When judgment arrived, it fit the pattern that had preceded it. Firm, unsurprising, framed as proportionate. Western governments condemned the process while noting the absence of overt abuse. That distinction mattered because it neutralized certain lines of attack and reinforced others. It allowed Moscow to say that fairness had guided the hand, even as the sentence served policy aims. In cafes and offices around Europe, the conversation shifted again. Some concluded that this was the price of operating in shadows. Others insisted that the work remained indispensable and that the real failure lay in exposure rather than intent. Either way, the trial put an end to uncertainty about what had happened to the pilot. It did not settle what would happen next between rivals who had just discovered the limits of their own narratives. The courtroom doors closed, but the diplomatic hallway outside felt longer than before, and it offered only narrow exits. After the verdict, the conversation traveled from court transcripts to committee rooms. In Washington, hearings took shape with familiar rhythms. Witnesses arrived with folders. Members asked pointed questions that touched policy without naming sources. The tone was respectful, controlled, and heavy with implication. The aim was to show diligence without revealing methods, to acknowledge error without conceding ground. Across departments, reviews began that probed routines developed over years. The questions sounded simple but carried weight. What approvals were needed? How risks were measured? Where lines had been crossed or blurred by habit? Answers emerged in phrases that signaled caution, necessary, regrettable, proportionate. These words served as tools for holding a diverse coalition together. Inside Allied capitals, leaders asked for briefings that spoke to both safety and strategy. They wanted assurance that skies would not become theaters of humiliation again. They also wanted continuity against threats that did not advertise themselves. Private notes expressed support laced with worry. Public statements struck balanced chords that defended partnership while urging restraint. Two indicators shaped the public mood during this period. First, the pattern of official language shifted over weeks, from guarded denial to traced acceptance, which suggested internal debate rather than a unified line. Second, documents surfaced in limited, curated ways, often through interviews or controlled releases, that hinted at scale without inviting a new scandal. Those signals kept interest high and controversy contained. In the Soviet Union, publications presented the incident as a confirmation of long-held claims. The state protected its people against intrusion. The court had spoken. The government had acted with discipline and resolve. Yet even there, planners recognized that victory carried a shadow. If one flight could be stopped, others might still pass unseen. If a courtroom could win an argument, it could not seal an enormous sky. That awareness informed public messaging that mixed pride with vigilance. It suggested watchfulness without panic. Meanwhile, tactical communities on both sides drew private lessons. They examined routes and altitudes. They considered weather, timing, and patterns of defense. These were not matters for microphones. They were careful studies that replaced certainty with provisional judgments. The effect on diplomacy was indirect but strong. Future meetings would open with longer preliminaries. Drafts would now anticipate exposure with more precision. Clauses about verification gained space. Language about respect for frontiers received heavier ink. Leaders learned that rhetoric could not absorb every shock. They needed buffers in text and practice. At home, the American public faced a different reckoning. The episode touched a belief in openness and in the competence of institutions. Citizens could accept secrecy when it promised safety. They struggled when secrecy failed, and the failure carried a public cost. Newspapers printed editorials that weighed necessity against prudence. Some praised the administration for candor once the facts hardened. Others argued that early evasions had harmed trust more than any admission would. The debate did not produce a final answer. It produced a map of limits for future leaders. In classrooms and clubs, the incident became a case study without footnotes. People discussed how rivals behave when caught and how states recover after missteps. They noted that apologies are rare because they travel poorly across borders. They observed that even rivals prefer opponents who are predictable. The lesson for many was restrained and sober. Strength requires information. Information requires risks. Risks require discipline and contingency plans that assume failure. That chain was not new. It simply became harder to ignore. In Moscow, the narrative settled into a rhythm of confidence. The state had proven its readiness. The pilot had confessed his role. The court had acted with composure. Yet this narrative carried a warning for its authors. A show of strength can fix an image in place. It can make later compromise look like retreat. That prospect complicated decisions that would come with the next crisis. Planners understood that the most effective victories are modest, and that overstatement creates demands that governance cannot meet. As spring turned to summer, the two sides returned to routine. Patrols continued, briefings resumed. Summits were mentioned, then placed on distant calendars. The memory of the incident remained, however, in every draft and every briefing. It reminded statesmen that a high sky is a busy place, and that silence there is never absolute. It reminded citizens that great power rests on practices they will not see until one day they do. It reminded both that exposure does not only punish immediate actors, it reshapes the field for seasons to come. That awareness became the quiet legacy of a flight that failed and a trial that did not. The Paris meeting had promised modest movement, not transformation. By the time delegations packed their papers, even modest movement seemed ambitious. The summit dissolved into statements delivered to microphones outside rather than proposals exchanged inside. The American leaders spoke of responsibility paired with necessity. The Soviet leaders spoke of sovereignty paired with vigilance. Neither line converted the other. Both lines satisfied audiences at home. European partners issued careful remarks that read like bandages. They tried to protect transatlantic cohesion while signaling that surprises carry costs. This balance is the permanent art of alliance in a hard era. The lost summit produced consequences that were less visible than a collapsed treaty, yet still significant. Working groups that might have clarified small issues were postponed. Channels that carried informal messages cooled by degrees. Travel schedules thinned. When meetings resumed at lower levels, participants moved with caution, born of recent embarrassment. They avoided big steps. They returned to draft language that circled familiar ground, restoring a rhythm that suited those who feared sudden shifts. Two indicators showed how deep the bruise had become. First, public references to long-term arrangements decreased for a season, replaced by talk of near-term management and orderly vigilance. Second, intelligence communities received a mandate that was both supportive and limiting. Continue collection with higher discipline. Reduce the visibility of failure. These instructions reflected a political reality. Leaders had to balance the hunger for knowledge against the cost of being caught again. In Moscow, victory carried expectations. The image of firmness had to be maintained without tipping into recklessness. A rival who expects routine wins may demand them, and those demands can box a statesman into hard corners. The same risk applied in Washington, where opponents pressed for clarity that could not always be given. Precise reforms are difficult to discuss in public when the practice itself relies on opacity. The result was a posture of guarded continuity. Nothing essential would be abandoned, but appearances would be managed with extra care. Beyond the capitals, the incident shaped how non-aligned states read the superpowers. Some saw a giant caught in the act and a rival who handled the moment with stagecraft. Others saw two giants trapped in a cycle that punished transparency and rewarded theater. Few saw a path to relief in the short term. That perception mattered because it influenced votes, speeches, and the texture of global forums where every sentence carries layered meanings. The press adapted too. Reporters learned to track the choreography of disclosure as closely as the facts. They watched for pauses before admissions. They cataloged changes in phrasing across days. They measured silence as a form of speech. This literacy made later coverage more nuanced and sometimes more skeptical. It also raised the bar for official communication, which now needed to anticipate a sharper audience. Inside ministries, planners stockpiled contingencies like careful clerks. They wrote scripts for incidents that might mirror the experience of 1960. They built decision trees that assumed partial exposure at inconvenient times. They trained spokespeople to use verbs that acknowledged while they contained. This preparation did not guarantee protection. It did, however, reduce the chance that one surprise could undo a season of work. In households, the memory aged into a cautionary tale. Parents explained to teenagers why leaders chose caution or pride. Teachers drew maps and traced lines that showed both distance and proximity. Clergy and union leaders, veterans and shopkeepers each turned the news into guidance for daily patience. The Cold War settled back into its measured grind, yet the grind felt slightly altered. The surface looked unchanged. The underlying confidence had shifted. The idea that the two sides could manage embarrassments privately had broken. In its place stood a recognition that exposure travels fast and far, and that recovery is measured in muted seasons rather than dramatic reconciliations. The lost summit became shorthand for a missed chance that might not return soon. It hinted at a future where talks would require thicker cushions and stronger carpets to absorb the weight of secrets sitting under the table. It left both sides alert to the next tremor, and to the possibility that the next tremor would arrive not with an explosion, but with a small detail appearing in a public place at a most inconvenient hour. By the end of 1960, the episode felt settled on paper but not in spirit. The sky had been marked by a failure, the ground by a verdict, and the conference table by an empty chair. Official accounts now fit inside neat folders. Private doubts did not. What remained was a residue of vigilance that touched every future draft and every planned route. The lesson was not only about altitude or borders, it was about how narratives harden when evidence stands under bright lights, and how concessions turn brittle when audiences grow watchful. Apparent victories can limit options. Carefully worded regrets can invite fresh demands. Between those edges, states try to move without tearing their own fabric. The world returned to routines that seemed familiar yet felt revised by caution. Crews worked with steadier checklists. Diplomats rehearsed lines that balanced duty and restraint. Editors prepared space for the next disclosure they hoped would never arrive. The central questions did not yield clean answers. How much secrecy can a free society carry? How much exposure can a rival tolerate before it closes doors that matter? Which risks deserve acceptance when the cost of error lands in full view? These questions hung over the decade's opening like contrails that refused to fade. The story of one flight and one courtroom had not ended the contest. It had only clarified the terms. Somewhere, schedules were being written with thicker margins. Somewhere, a future meeting waited for a quieter season. Whether that season would come remained an open line on every calendar that counted power by patience rather than speed.